Um, We've got the challenges, what their strengths are. We also introduce them to skills and behaviors, and we want them to start thinking about what skills they want to develop while they're on this co-op work term. And again, what we're doing is just really trying to get them to think about, why they're on this co-op term. We also want them to let us know if they're stressed or overwhelmed, what we should be looking for, what their expectations of us are, and anything else that they would like to share with us. At the end of the term, the students also will be doing an ePortfolio presentation. And so I'm just giving them a heads up here on what they'll be doing. We have them go through, they can either talk about 3 skills that they've developed and how they did that while they were with us, or they can talk about it around things like the inspired insight, magnificent failures, and unanticipated connections. And what we really like about this is we want our students to be thinking about things that didn't go wrong, didn't go well, or things that didn't work out as they expected, because this is probably where most of our learning happens. So we're actually asking them to focus and share on that. They also will be told that they can, about a month before, we want them to submit their ePortfolio in progress. Then about 2 weeks before the presentation they'll be doing, we want them to give each other feedback. They can do it using the feedback feature, or they can sit with each other and, just review each other's portfolio. Then they do a practice presentation with me or their supervisors, just to, so they'll feel comfortable when they're actually in front of all of our staff. And they do a presentation to our staff on what they've learned, what it was like working with CTE at our staff meeting. It's really informal. We love it as staff because we like to hear, what our students are experiencing. And it's a great opportunity for the students to just share, and we celebrate what they've done. Some of the other things that we have them think about in week 1, what are your short-term goals? We want them to think about the goals that they have for this term. They're not tied to these goals, but again, we're starting to think, we want them to know that being on co-op is a learning, and we want them to make the most of it. So we're asking them to make SMART goals. We want them to talk about the interests that they have. We're also interested in technical skills that they bring. And the reason we ask these 2 questions is if they're interested in something, we can then say, oh, there are some projects going on. Would you like to help out with those? So it, allows them to do a little bit beyond their job or really work towards what they're interested in. Knowing what their technical skills are allows us to give them work that can play to their strengths. We introduce them again to our Future Ready Talent Framework, and you'll see that the PebblePad workbook also allows them to add evidence. So as they're doing tasks, we're giving them the opportunity to, if you have evidence of how you've been able to self-manage, you can start adding this. And the reason I like this is at the midpoint, they can start looking at the evidence that they've added. And if one of the things they wanted to work on was communication and they haven't added any evidence of it, then they still have, 6 weeks that they can still go ahead and start working towards one of the goals that they have. Again, in week 2, we ask them to, this is pretty much what we ask them every week now. What are your projects? What are your resources? And this is where we started introducing them to Riff. So what did you do or try that was successful? What did you try that was not successful? And then we have a little chat about what Riff is and introduce them to how Riff can help them think more deeply about each of these experiences. Again, we have something here where we have them think about their skills. We introduce them to the high fives, their strengths. We ask them to speak to each other just so they can get to know, their co-op students. Charley was with us the past year, so it will be interesting for her to see whether her 5 strengths are still the same. We can discuss that. We also, again, constantly are reminding them that you will be preparing for your portfolio. So start taking a look at some of the portfolios, answer some questions, which ones resonated. And the other thing we have them do is every co-op student has to do a co-op evaluation that they fill in. We have them do it at week 6, where they fill it out and they add evidence which justifies, why did you give yourself a 1 or why did you give yourself a 3? Their supervisor will also be filling out this very same page, and then there'll be a discussion about what does evidence look like, what will I be looking for if you want to move up the scale, or why are you being so hard on yourself. Oftentimes the students will mark themselves really low when actually they're doing quite well. So it's a really good time to check in. This workbook is right on the first page. We tell them that the people that will be looking at this will be your supervisors. So not everybody in CTE is going to be looking at this. It will be mainly their supervisors and me that are looking at it. Again, we also stress that this isn't being marked. If they don't, they're going to get out of it what they put into some of the feedback. Charley has given me permission to share their portfolio. So I am able to go in, I can look at some of the, what has been added here, and I can give some feedback. I can add feedback. If I had a rubric, which I'm not using on this one, I can add the rubric. And if I wanted to, I could add a grade. Again, when we have our grades and we use Atlas, the grade does go down to the grade book in Learn. So you can start collecting grades and using it within your courses, and it is integrated. However, I'm not giving grades. So for the first few weeks, I go in and I will give them tips on things they can do to make their reflections a little bit more robust. Places they might, remind them, don't forget to add that as evidence, but again, it's up to them. I'm not marking them. They're going to have to use these reflections to do their midpoint evaluation, and they're going to be using these reflections to create their portfolio. So, the more they put into it, the more prepared they'll be for their presentation. Individual student has access to their own individual workbook. So it's the co-op student. So Charley would have one. And Luxman, who is with us today, he's a co-op student. He has his own workbook that he fills in. So they are the co-op students. So we ask the co-op students to fill in their weekly journals. So I'm delighted to have Leticia with us. I was able to hear a webinar that she had done I guess it was maybe about a year ago. And then I was very intrigued with Riff. So what I did was I read about it, and then I decided to try it with our co-op students. So we have 2 co-op students a term. So in winter 2024, I had the co-op students start using Riff. And so the nice thing about the co-op students we have with us today is Eleanor is in the spring term, and Eleanor completed her workbook for the first 6 weeks without using Riff. And then for the last 6 weeks, we asked Eleanor, and I can't remember, it was Katie. We introduced them to Riff, and then we asked them to complete the next 6 weeks using Riff, and just, commenting on how that impacted the quality of their reflections. And then Charley is a very interesting case, because Charley was with us before I had heard of Riff, and they had completed their workbook without using Riff at all. And now they've come back and they're completing the same workbook, except they're using Riff. So Charley will be telling us what it was like to compare the reflections. And also, because they can find their workbook very easily, they have access to their previous workbook, and they can compare the responses they had made in the fall 2023 term with the quality of the responses that they will be making in this current term. So with that, why don't we learn a little bit more about Riff? And I'll pass it to you, Leticia.
Great,
Thank
fantastic. Thank you, Catherine, for the kind invitation. Is for me, working with educators is my favorite thing to do. So thank you for giving me this opportunity and actually hearing from students who are using Riff. It's an added treat. So I'm really excited and curious to hear their perspective, and I almost want to say let's just go there and like hear from the students. But I do think it's important for all of us to kind of like have a some context and a shared experience that then can inform like a conversation and a discussion on any and all aspects that you all are interested in. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me find the right tab among the many. I think this is it. All right, so great. Let me see. Oh, okay.
Awesome. And we can see your screen. Yes.
Okay.
Supporting learning.
It's just
through
like
AI.
yeah. Great. I'm just like not sure like how Teams work, so making sure that this works. Fantastic. So yeah. So let me just tell you a little bit about me very quickly. 3 things. One is I was born in Uruguay in the south of South America, tiny country, 3.5 million people overall. I grew up in Colombia as a kid, so kind of like moved up a little bit north in South America, and I've been in California and at Stanford more specifically for the past 2 decades now, so it's been a while. I am a scientist by training. My PhD is in developmental biology and computer science. But now, currently, and for a while, I've been doing experiments in learning, in teaching and learning. So you see here a photo from like something that you might see at the Institute of Design at Stanford, where we have offerings and classes and programs for graduate students at Stanford of all disciplines. We also grant degrees in design, the bachelor's and master's in design. And we also have, we work with learners, what we call professional learners, including educators, K-12, university, but also practitioners in the social sector, folks who work in industry. So I kind of like, have the fortune to work with many types of learners. And part of what I do is to kind of like think about the future of teaching and learning, right? Like what teaching and learning is today, but what could be, right? Like in a proximal, but also in a distant future. So we run a few experiments on that. And I'd like to tell you 3 things that I think I know about you, and you can tell me if I'm right. One is that you're interested in reflection because you sort of like came here today. And this, by the way, is a photo that I took in the Amazon. The really black water created an incredible surface to create this reflective effect. You also all are interested and or use PebblePad, which I didn't know as a tool. I'm not familiar with the tool, so I'm also glad I'm learning about it today. And third, you are probably expecting that I'm just gonna kind of like give you a talk, a lecture on reflection and Riff. This is, by the way, me at a 3rd century Roman amphitheater in Byblos, what is today Lebanon. And I'm reflecting here, I remember being in that moment, I'm reflecting how the spaces that we currently use for teaching, sometimes including the virtual spaces, are pretty much like this, right? Like a an amphitheater, which is like an audience, and then there's a person at the center. And these spaces were more like, were designed for entertaining, and therefore, and like, having very distinct roles of the audience and the performers. And yet we continue to use spaces like this. And I was here reflecting, what does that say about, our philosophies for teaching and learning? But I'm hoping that on this third point, I'm going to disappoint you. Okay, I am really hoping to disappoint you. And actually, I have a challenge for all of you. So whether you are camera on or not, I'm hoping that you will engage in this activity. So there's going to be a short activity that you can do on your own, on a piece of paper, on a notebook. So if you don't have anything to write, maybe like this, the moment to kind of like, reach somewhere and grab something that you can write on. Like if you don't want to write, that's fine too. And you will need your phone too, although you can use your computer, but using your phone is better, so you can kind of like still keep visibility of the presentation on the screen, and get instructions on the phone. So everyone's ready. So those, if you're on camera, you can give me a thumbs up or like a nod or something that you're ready. And I'm hoping that everyone else is kind of like, okay, I'm here, and I'm seeing some like virtual thumbs up. Fantastic. So here we go. And I'm going to put an Emma, you had, okay, I think it was just like, Emma, let me know if you had a question, but I saw kind of like hands up. I think it was just like the thumbs up. I'm going to just like change the slide, and your challenge will be there. Is going to be, the instructions are going to be whatever is in the slides, and that's it. And I'm going to, in the meantime, like give myself the challenge of see if I can share some music as you work, some kind of like, instrumental music. So here we go. Here's the challenge for you. And then we'll use this to reflect on it. A challenge for you. Here's the QR code. I won't answer any questions, and you have 3 minutes to work on the challenge. No, really, I won't answer any questions. And your time is ticking, so get started. Right, and time's up. I don't know if I managed with my challenge of making the music, getting to you. Did you hear any music or not? Or it was just me and my headphones. Okay, probably it's because I'm on headphones. So that was your challenge. And hopefully you can still see my screen. So that was you on your own, and you had this ambiguous, like a really fast challenge, right? You may have gotten, by the way, Protobot, randomizes combinations of kind of like forms or like, containers, and sort of like for what and like goals. So it has like, 47,000 combinations. So you each got like a completely different one. And maybe you continue pressing randomize until you got one that you liked, and that's fine too, right? You may have gotten something like this, or like this, right? Like some that make like no sense whatsoever. So now we're going to allow you to kind of like use Riff to reflect on, and actually it's not a collaborative experience. Like last time, like, I did this with a group actually of teachers working on portfolios, and we were in the room, so they worked in pairs. In this case, well, let me rephrase that. It was a collaborative, it was not a collaborative experience. It was more a individual experience, but a creative experience. And for that reflection, you're going to use Riff. So some of you know Riff, have been introduced to it, but for those who have not, Riff is an inquisitive chatbot powered by generative AI. We can talk more about the technical details if anyone is interested later. Designed to ask reflective questions that help learners make sense of their experiences and educators make learning visible. And so we're going to try it. A couple of things to keep in mind. What you write will be registered and will be read only by me. It will not be shared with anyone else. We will analyze together all anonymous reflections. So we will do that together. And the data, your conversations, will be not used to train any AI models that power Riff. So that's something to keep in mind. So kind of like you're in charge, right? Like, so, you know, you can kind of like even say like, oh, I don't want to answer that question, or let's go in a different direction, right? Like, so you're in charge, but like, you know, let's see how it goes. So with that, let me switch to, great. So you will use this QR code, and, or if not, you can also type that that URL, and I'm gonna give you, I think I said 4 minutes for this reflection, and yeah, and then we'll talk about it. So I'm gonna let you work on that. I'm going to chat. I'm going to start the timer, and let you reflect for 5 minutes. All right, so time is up. We're going to pause there. If you wanted, you could end the reflection. You don't have to. If you do, is going to Riff is going to prompt you to whether you want to enter your email and get the whole chat log of the reflection, or just the summary. You can also do it later. But let's reflect on that reflection. So a book that I published last year as part of a series of books that the D.school published, Experiments in Reflection, has a framework about reflection that is what powers Riff. So in the book is presented as 3 dimensions of reflection. And the first one is to notice, to use reflection as a tool for awareness, for, being better at noticing details of our world, but also internally noticing our emotions and how they affect how we act. The second dimension and the second collection of experiments in the book, it's about making sense. It's about going beneath the surface of what we observe and what is said, and just dig deeper and uncover what's not obvious. And the third dimension, and this one is a little bit like counterintuitive, it's about reflecting forward and envisioning, right? Like, and thinking about, how can we think about the future not as something inevitable that we're just like headed in that direction and we have no agency about it, but like, how can we reflect on possible futures, and then think about like, well, what can we do today to drive towards futures that we want and avoid some of the things that may be sometimes even scary, right? And like, how can we get ahead of what of consequences that are unintended, and that may be negative, even with the best intentions. So these dimensions are based on what we know about how we learn, and specifically, if we, and this is kind of like, of course, kind of like one slice of a lot of what we know about how we learn, right? Like, but when we think about our brain cortex, right, like there's the sensory cortex that it's all about getting information from the world into our brain using all of our senses. There's the integrative cortex that also has like 2 distinct areas, this cortex is all about making connections that generate new understanding and new ideas. And finally, the motor cortex, that it's about acting. It allows us to move, to test new hypotheses and ideas, and move in a broad, concept of moving. It might be writing. It might be kind of like, physically moving. And in this book that I really highly recommend to all educators, but also to anyone really, and as a learner as well, The Art of Changing the Brain by James Zool, a biochemist. He talks about learning as transformation of experience from past into future, from external knowledge into internal knowledge. So, once we kind of like really learn, like we don't necessarily need to go back to kind of like what was that source or that experience that I had that helped me learn X, but you are now internalizing knowledge that you can refer to. And very importantly, locus of control, a transition of the locus of control from others to ourselves, right? Like, is learning happens in us, right? And that's something that sometimes as teachers is kind of like, it's both key, but it's also difficult, sort of like hard to realize, like, no matter what we do, learning happens in the learner, right? Like, and we can only create the conditions for that to happen. Zool talks about like different types of imbalance learning. For instance, when we sort of like only are using the cortex, the sensory cortex, and we're just like, gathering information without doing anything with it, right? Like, that's not real learning. The other type of imbalanced learning is when we kind of like rush to do things and don't, spend the time to really use the integrative cortex to make connections and so reflection for me is about balancing learning. It's about taking all of those functions and kind of like creating a balanced approach, right? Or a balanced process that helps us learn. So Riff, starting by asking you, sorry, I didn't modify this slide. How was it to work on an ambiguous challenge right now, right? Like, not with a partner, but right now, right? So this was a question that I actually had scripted, right? Like, I customized Riff to ask you this question in particular. But then Riff's follow-up questions, which were AI generated, may have touched on any or maybe all of these dimensions in some way, right? So let's test that. Let's see what happened in this group, right? Like, so think about your conversation that you had with Riff. What did that reflection, sometimes I use this kind of like, made up term, include, right? Was it about, did Riff kind of like prompt you to notice, to kind of like describe, be more specific, talk about like, well, what exactly happened? Talk about your emotions. Was it about making sense, right? It could be about like, well, what might that mean? Like making connections, interpretations, inferences. Or was it about envisioning? Was it about projecting of like, well, what about like future situations? What might you do differently in the future, right? Like, so, and it can be, again, like, a combination or like an interception or like, an overlap of two or more of these, right? Like, so use this QR code or this link that I'm gonna also put here on the chat to place a pin on kind of like what area characterized your conversation. And again, it can be kind of like one of these dimensions. It can be an overlap of two or more, or an overlap of the three. So we're seeing kind of like, and of course, like you had a short time, but kind of like 5 minutes is sort of like about a good time to have like a conversation with Riff, although I see some folks who have like very long ones, right? Like, so it really depends. Okay, so we're seeing some noticing only and some overlaps between noticing and envisioning, or noticing and making sense, one at the intersection of the three. Great, fantastic. I'm gonna wait a little bit so everyone can and in the meantime, I'm gonna scan the chat. Fantastic. So I'm gonna move on from here. Thank you for sharing these, and I'm going to actually taken a screenshot of this. Let me, so I can, when I share my slides, then I can share them with the results. Fantastic. And just wanted to mention that reflection is one of those words that, right, like are a suitcase word in the words of Marvin Minsky. Those words that contain a variety of meaning packed in them. And so we might be using the same word and meaning very different things. So for me, that's why with the book, Experiments in Reflection, it was important to kind of like come up with, of course, there's many definitions by many scholars, right? Like, but come up with something that felt actionable and it felt that it could help people and learners, actually reflect effectively. And I did some informal experiments in my classroom about that. So, and I love this quote by James Zool, right? Like of kind of like the biology, right? Like of reflection is searching for connections, literally, right? Like is what's happening in the brain. It's trying different connections until like there's some things that like stick, and then that create new neuronal pathways. And this other quote: we need reflection to develop complexity. We may start with a direct and relatively simple concrete experience. In this case, like you did a 3-minute kind of like ambiguous and funky challenge. But that experience grows richer as we allow our brain the freedom and search for those still unknown connections. And as we find those connections, our brain changes. So really it's like Riff allows you to kind of like start asking yourself different kinds of questions to search for those connections, right? Like, and hopefully this is not, I'm not seeing Riff as something that creates a dependency or becomes a crutch. It's like, oh, the only way that you can reflect, in a effective way is by using this tool, right? It's a tool that should help you, ask yourself these questions by yourself, right? Like regardless of the tool that you use, right? Like, so it's a training tool in that sense. So the definition of reflection that I use in the book is reflection as a whole body process. We often forget that we have, a whole body and not just our brain, of transforming experience into meaning to shape the future, right? And those are the 3 dimensions that I mentioned, right? Like the noticing, the making sense, and the envisioning. And reflection as part of learning experiences in particular might look like, a written reflection, maybe as part of a portfolio, a group debrief, a parent share, you name it, right? And I'm seeing in the comments, for instance, it's kind of like, well, but it's kind of like really not, this is not like a real connection with a person, right? Like my goal is never to replace the conversations that you would have as a group or individually with a teacher, with peers, right? But oftentimes, and like going on one of the later comments by Sandra on the chat, that sometimes students who are introvert or neurodivergent, right? Like and like they might like struggle to in a setting where like, okay, let's talk about this, right? Like they might not be the first ones to share something, right? Like, so this allows for kind of like a reflection and also kind of like the data that is created by the conversation can be used by the teacher. And that's what I want us to kind of like look at before we wrap this up, right? Like, so for the student, it's about making learning personal, right? Like, because the connections that each of you made has to do with your experience, your values, your motivations, your interests. So the conversation went in different places. But for the teacher, it's about making that learning visible, right? Like, and seeing like, it's interesting that this emerged, right? So I'm going to show you, I'm going to jump, and I know that, and Catherine, let me know like if we're doing poorly on time, but I want to kind of like share with you the platform for the educator. And this is something that the students might not have seen, so that now they see how it looks for the educator in the back. that the ability to customize, like I just did for the Riff that I offer for you, the customize the initial prompt, the context, but also the ability to see and analyze and synthesize.
So Eleanor, I'm really looking forward. So I'd like to introduce Eleanor Walby. So Eleanor was our co-op student with CTE for the spring 2024 term. And I'm really glad that she has been able to make time for us to come back and share her experience using Riff. And I'm curious too, Eleanor, I know people were asking about how long you had to stay with Riff, before you found it maybe not as helpful. And I'm also curious, if it taught you prompts or whatever, that even if you don't use Riff now, how has that transferred forward? So please, yes, share.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Yeah, with the kind of the time limit, I found when I was using it, there was like a 10 minutes kind of, that was like the window, and then it would kind of repeat some of the questions. But I also found that the 10-minute was a lot of time for me to reflect, so it didn't really constrain anything. But yeah, typically my use with Riff, I had a lot of luck with it because I used it in the second half of my term. So I did see a lot of growth in my reflections, and they got a lot longer. Already I do like to reflect. I like reflecting. I like writing a lot. So it wasn't like a struggle for me to give Riff a lot of information. But yeah, I think my favorite thing about it is I think the lack of how personal it is, because it doesn't feel personal. I think sometimes when you're like giving someone a lot of information and you're trying to reflect and you're talking about a lot of things, it kind of, if it's an actual person, you can be worried about judgment, feedback, a little bit of criticism. But with Riff, obviously the responses are very question based. So it just feels like, okay, I'm just going to keep thinking about this. And they're not, whoever this is, it's not a person, but the robot's not going to judge me. And so I liked being able to have the distinguishing between the personal, an actual personal connection, and then the roboticness of it. I really liked that. I liked that the questions were very solution based. I think sometimes when I'm doing my reflections, I just like to think about the what, and I don't think about the further aspects of it. So having the solution-based questions, asking you to dig deeper, the challenging things, like asking, what about this challenge? What if you encountered this? Things like that really helped me when I was reflecting, especially for my work term. If I came up with something that happened at work, something didn't go according to plan, it would really help me kind of think about future challenges that might be connected to it, and ways that I can kind of weed out those things. So I really liked that. But yeah, I think it is AI, so it is a little bit unsettling at first, and I'm kind of skeptical of it. So, that happens. That's pretty typical, I think. But with the robot and kind of just knowing in the back of my brain, that's not actually a person. They can't really hurt me. This is just me sharing, and I think that really helped me kind of get past the skepticism of it, because I think AI, I'm iffy about it. I think it has pros and cons. So, but being able to use it in a reflective way was really helpful, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. As I say, Eleanor has to leave. Are there any questions that you might want to ask Eleanor?
I have one, but also Gail has one. Go ahead, Gail.
Oh, you're muted, Gail.
I just said, you go first, Leticia, because you're the expert. I'm curious what your question is.
I mean, I don't know if the expert, but I'm like super interested to hear more about the, you said like that, sharing the things with Riff didn't feel personal. How did you feel about the fact, like, I'm assuming you knew that the teacher would read the conversations, right? Like, how did that feel?
I think it was more because it wasn't like the immediate feedback, like the face-to-face kind of thing. Because also with PebblePad, my supervisors were also reading PebblePad and stuff, so I kind of knew that it was getting read and sometimes given feedback for. But I think it was more just, okay, this is not. It's a very judgment-free zone, and the instance or the immediate response wasn't too critical. And I think that allowed me to kind of bypass a little bit of the self-consciousness that I might have felt if it was like an in-person kind of thing.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a two-parter question. One is what we know about reflection, and I think we all experience this. You said that you really like to reflect, Eleanor, so you may look forward to it. For me, it's like, I've got to carve out time to think deeply and carefully about this. Did Riff kind of spur you on to like, oh, I have this intelligent agent that can help me. I'm really curious to dig deeper. Did that make you embrace reflection even more than you already have?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting because even if I'm somebody who likes to reflect, I don't always know the direction to take with it. So it was kind of like I can just relax. I just have to answer all of these questions and you don't have to do too much of like the thinking, what am I supposed to be reflecting about? It kind of guides you in that way, which is kind of it's really helpful to just be able to just sit back and just kind of let your thoughts follow the questions. It was more of a relaxing, it wasn't a stressful experience. Sometimes reflecting can be a little bit, oh, I'm supposed to be thinking this deeply and things like that. It wasn't like that at all. It was good.
So then my second part, and it's something that David
Mhm.
is also curious about, it's about that sense of safety. Did you feel like who else is peering in this, or did you feel like it was just kind of this private experience between you and Riff and perhaps your teacher?
Yeah, it did feel more private. I think with AI, it's kind of, and if it's online, sometimes there's the who could possibly see this? Could somebody access this other than, me and who else I know is looking at it? But I think I wasn't reflecting about really deeply personal things. It was more work-based, solution-based, challenge-based. And I think because there wasn't the super personal aspect for me, that I was more comfortable with creating a spot where I could just think about like the solutions in the workplace specifically. And that was kind of what it created for me, and a safe space for that. And I wasn't too worried about other people accessing it. I don't know if it's because I'm really comfortable with the one-on-one texting kind of thing. So maybe that's just kind of how I feel about it, but it did feel pretty closed.
Thank
One
you.
of the things I liked about Riff is I felt it complemented PebblePad because you still had the workbook. It was all in one place because I asked the students to put their reflection in there. But what Riff did was it started a conversation. And even though PebblePad allows you to provide feedback, it might have been a week, before
Mhm.
I responded back, and so by that time, I'm sure Eleanor and Charley probably had lost interest in that conversation and had moved on. So I really see, if there was a way to integrate these more closely, or the way I've done it is just, have the link to Riff there and then have the students, bring it back. I thought that was sort of the best of both worlds. Um, why don't we pass it over to you, Charley? And again, Charley had the experience of going through a whole term with CTE where they had not used Riff. I didn't know about it then. And now they've come back and they are using Riff. And as I mentioned, Charley is able to go back and compare, how the quality of the reflections they had done the year before with the quality now. So yes, please, Charley.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like I can provide a kind of unique perspective because I worked with CTE in the spring of 2023. And at that point, our PebblePad reflection books were mostly just like a weekly tracking, ensuring that your supervisors know what you're working on, how you're feeling about it, that type of thing. And we were doing a thing where we used a mapping capability. So we would link all of our evidence to the future talent ready framework, all the F's and the T's, that one. And it was really exciting to come back and not just be able to look at my old reflections, but to start using Riff, and like it definitely like everyone has been saying, it has really reflected me or prompted me to reflect deeper. And before, I felt that I was completing my journals just for that, for completion. I said, oh, this is part of my job. I need to track my work process. But by getting a little bit deeper into my reflection with Riff, I started thinking about things that I wouldn't have on my own when I'm asked individually, oh, reflect about this experience. Like Eleanor said, it asks you a lot of questions that make you think beyond the what, like the why, the how, and with the sorry, I lost my train of thought, but with those three sort of areas that Leticia was talking about in her presentation, um, you're able to see the different realms that your thinking can go into. And so I was able to start thinking more with Riff about how I feel about what I experienced and how I want to be able to move forward with my new knowledge. And it's really important to be able to look back on. And I mean, Eleanor made her comparison with the 6 weeks before and after, and I definitely also have seen that with my old workbook, which had 1 or 2 sentences worth of reflection a week, just saying, yeah, no, like things were good this week. Let's move on. But now it's thinking about how I apply what I go through to future situations, how I take myself into the workplace and like approach situations with a reflective attitude so that, like you said, you can be more proactive about things. So I totally agree with Eleanor that I really loved the live feedback, the live judgment-free feedback that it provided. And to touch on some of those concerns that were in the comments about security, or that sense of like, well, am I talking to a person or a robot? Like, we know that our supervisors can look in on our reflections, but often they won't unless there's something specifically not necessarily concerning them, but something that's like piqued their interest, and they're like, oh, this one particular task was a lot for Charley to take on. Let's go see how they're feeling about that. They can go into my journals and just check in with me. But again, like Eleanor said, we're talking mostly about work tasks and like, oh, I forgot to BCC on that email. It doesn't get too personal. It's not like disclosing any crazy personal information. When the tech would become obsolete. I mean, at a certain point, yes, but I think where I'm at with reflection, like I'm very early in my reflective journey. I'm not a journaling type of person like Eleanor is. So I think about how I feel a lot as a psych major, but I don't really put it into words very often. So it would take me probably a few years of using Riff before I would have the tools like already sort of like in my tool belt. I wouldn't need the Riff bot. But like everyone was saying in the comments, like this, I think it could be a really, really important and useful tool for neurodivergent students who they have these feelings, they have these thoughts. It's just a matter of having that sit down conversation with your supervisors. And yes, we do meet with our supervisors daily. It's not a position where we're thrown to the wolves or anything, but it's just that idea of having a third party who obviously is completely unbiased. They are not a person. That person to talk to is great.
So Eleanor has to head out. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for making time to join us and share your experience. I know one of the highlights is definitely hearing students, voices in that. So really appreciate you joining us. So
thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Really appreciate your perspective.
There was a question for Charley. I'm curious how I'm curious to hear about the safety with the Riff bot, Charley.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. I mean, honestly, it's not something I think about too much, to be honest, because similar to Eleanor, AI has been.
Well, I think that as any tool, it really depends how you use it, right? Like, so what I want to show you is how I envision that this can add value, right? Like, so that is just not like outsourcing your conversation. Oh, great. Like now, instead of just meeting with the students, I'll just give them a link and then like, there you have it. And like now I go home early, but it's really about like the affordances of the back end, right? Like and there's so many things that we can talk about. But let me share my screen to share you and we can kind of like analyze together the conversations that you all just had. So I'm going to show you here. This is the back end of for the teacher, in this case me. I'm just gonna make it a little bit larger so you can see on one hand kind of like the the bot, the general info of the bot, and like, and I can press here, for instance, if I wanted to make some changes, so you can see what, like, when I created it, these are the options that I had, right? Like, so I gave it an alias, which was just like, in this case, I just put this, but it could be class 1, or, you know, kind of like field trip to blah, 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 whatever it is, that kind of like, that's the activity, right? You can choose the language. It has a few different languages that everything can be on. The mode, so this is something that it can be text or text and voice. Text and voice is kind of like, it's been new as in a few as of a few weeks, so I don't know if Charley, if you have tried it, but like, basically the learner, the teacher decides whether to enable this possibility, and then the learner decides in the moment, like, do I want to talk to it or do I want to type, right? Like, it will depend on like where you are and things like that, and your preferences, but regardless of what you do, kind of like the transcript will be captured, right? The reflection length is just, this is, someone mentioned in the chat at some point, kind of like, will Riff like stop asking questions? And the answer is, it will not until you decide that the conversation is over, because the ending generative AI powered interaction is very difficult, and we explore different approaches, including kind of like, sort of like measuring the engagement of the human, and then like Riff suggesting like, hey, it seems that you're not that interested anymore, let's end here. But like the styles, as you'll see in a moment, of how the people interact in text are very different. So like, it's like, it's much rather, it's like, okay, the human should have like the control, and it's like, end the conversation whenever they are feeling like diminishing returns, right? And end it. But since for teachers, it was also important to give students sort of like an idea of what was expected, then we put here a reflection length, and it could go unlimited, right? Like, we could just go to whatever it is, or kind of like unlimited, or leave it unlimited. But the only thing that happens when it reaches 5 is that there's going to be, and I don't know, Charley, if you've seen it, like a little bit of like a confetti that it falls on the screen, but you can continue. It's just kind of like, hey, yeah, you meet like what your teacher suggested. The very important thing here is like the opening question, right? Like, so this is what is going to direct. I'm the teacher. I want you to think about, either in broad terms or in a specific thing about the what just happened. And so I can direct your attention, and that's the starting point, the common starting point. And here I added some like brief context for the bot. So it was like, what this was going to be used where. And then you save it, and then you can share it here, either with the link or the QR code, or embedded in different platforms in different ways. But what I really want to show to you, that I think is where the power is like the analyzing the reflections, right? Like, so we're going to start this copilot, and so all of the reflections, let me show you that first, the activity logs. So here we can see all of your reflections that this group enter, right? I can sort them, and you can see that some people like, maybe in some cases, the first one was kind of like a tech issue of some sorts, but like some people like, had 11 turns and 300 words. Some had like, 8 turns and 490 words, right? Like, and if I click on any of you, right? Like, so in any of those, right? And they're all like, encrypted. You can see that, like, and this is common for students to start with like a very brief thing. It's like, how was it? Like, fun, right? Like, so Riff is going to kind of like start like digging. It's like, could you describe a specific moment during the challenge that made it fun for you, right? And then take it from there. So you can see how like Riff is driving the conversation. And in some cases, it was kind of like, I wasn't sure where to start. And so Riff might say, the feeling of not knowing where to start can be quite significant. Could you tell me more about what made it challenging to take the first step, right? And so kind of like, in the conversation, Riff will help the learner go deeper. The Copilot is going to allow us to take all of those conversations as a data set and ask for things. So for instance, we can ask for like common themes. What are some common themes that emerge like across all of the reflections in this data set, right? And so we're going to get a summary of those. It should just take a few seconds, but it takes a little bit longer than the conversation because it's analyzing the whole data set, but hopefully it works. We need like some like music. There we go. Oh, why is it going? It's one of those things like there. Okay, so it's saying here, several common themes emerge. A significant number of students struggle with the ambiguity of the task, frequently mentioning feeling confused, unsure, or needing clear instructions, right? And another prevalent theme is the impact of time constraints, right? Many students felt rushed and that this negatively affected the quality of their work and the ability to fully express their ideas. Despite the challenges, a recurrent positive theme is the enjoyment and engagement derived from the creative aspects of the task. Many students found the absurd or unexpected nature of some prompts to be fun and stimulating. Finally, several reflections touch upon the importance of feedback and collaboration, right? Like, so this is something, this summary, and we can go to others, like, right, like, and other aspects of it and have Riff analyze, for instance, the, you know, kind of like the depth of the reflections across all of these. But this summary is something that I'm gonna do reset. I don't know why it got stuck. But since we don't have a lot of time, I'm not gonna try to restart it. But you can, like, one value that I see of Riff is to actually create that social learning aspect of it, right? Like, so taking all of the individual reflections and using this summary to then go back either asynchronously, like in a note or part of a portfolio, and say like, hey, these are some themes that emerge from everyone's reflections. Let's talk more about time constraints and what happened here, right? Like, and how time constraints can be perceived as a kind of like a limitation, but sometimes, like, you know, it actually like kickstarts your creativity, right? Like, so it can bring, and as someone mentioned, like, it can bring up the voices of students who would not normally participate. So you are, as the teacher, are bringing their voices and say like, hey, some of you mentioned this, right? Like, and so one student explicitly stated, I was looking for confirmation of my ideas and challenges that people could have to my ideas, which is very hard to do on your own, right? Like, so that student anonymously their voice is being lifted up and like presented to the class, right? Like, so that's one value of it. Yes, they're verbatim. But that's a good question. Initially, like, it will depend on if you have many, like, if you had like 200 reflections in the data set, then it would take too long to kind of like, or it would be a little bit technically challenged to feed everything to the Copilot. So in that case, the Copilot will not provide quotes, but the quotes that does provide, if it mentions this is what a student said, it would be a verbatim quote that you can find in the data set.
So in one of the modification sections, you can modify the first question and the initial prompts. I wonder if you can also modify the questions following that. So the second, third, and fourth questions, I wonder if we can guide the questions and make it follow a certain model.
Yeah. So no, because it's using generative AI, right? Like, so you can, of course, there is a set of instructions that directs the types of questions that it asks and like has a framework, you know, underlying the questioning, you know, types and directions, but you cannot guide the second and third question like in a very prescriptive way, because that's not how generative AI works. But that's the beauty. It is that it will respond to kind of like the specific answer, right? Like, so it would be different. It would be impossible to do because we don't know what each, right, like what each person is going to answer. So yeah, it's the nature of the technology. And in the meantime, I asked here for the Copilot for the depth of reflections across, right? And it says it varies, and it gives some examples of deep engagement with the prompts, and others shallower level of engagement. Several students provided brief, almost cursory answers, right? So yeah, this is something that also the teacher can kind of like longitudinally be looking at, right? Like, and even, you know, if the teacher is asking for, which is very common, especially because, again, we're not talking about like, this is not, you know, a therapist. Riff is not a therapist, right? Like, and it's, you know, a teaching assistant, if you will, that if you are asking for email, name and email at the outset, which a lot of teachers do because they want like to keep track of like, okay, you know, Catherine has completed the reflection, right? Like, so it's about like, you know, keeping track of the work done. So then you might like actually follow a given student and see how their reflections are evolving. As I mentioned, like the overall framework that Riff is using is based on those 3 dimensions of reflection that I explained. So that's, and as you can see, even from, you know, kind of like the empirical, you know, exploration that we did of looking at this. Well, I lost the results, right? Like, so these 3 dimensions, right? Like, and so these are the types of questions, like whether it focuses on just one or more than one, and in what order, it will depend on each particular conversation.
Thanks, Leticia. Kate?
Thank you. My question, Leticia, is for you more so than Charley, but I would be interested in hearing Charley's perspective. And it has to do with
Charley had to leave
oh,
early,
okay,
so yeah,
no problem.
So.
Yeah, my curiosity is around the like willingness or interest or uptake based on different generations, because I think about younger generations, like students are much more familiar with engaging and interacting and being very, you know, vulnerable and open digitally, whereas older generations much less so because we're not familiar with it. Yeah, do you have experience with that or could speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. On my end, I don't have data. I think your hunches, you know, I share your hunches about that. One thing that I would say as designer of this tool is that we have been very careful in like not opening access to you know, very young learners, right? Like, because I think we don't have enough information on how younger learners might, if they might, you know, create sort of like unproductive emotional attachments to these kinds of agents, right? Like, and how do they understand what it is, right? Like, that is, they're not talking to a human. So I wouldn't want to create, you know, a situation in which, you know, young people are like, well, you know, Riff is my friend, and like, I don't talk to my parents or my teachers anymore because only Riff understands me, right? Like, so being very careful about that. Yeah. Catherine, I don't know if you have a sense from your use of Riff.
So the folks that I have been using are co-op students. So, and I only have, like, there's only 6 that have used it. So I don't really want to say I can really make too much. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. I think there was one more question, but maybe they could reach out to Leticia directly. Anyways, Leticia, thank you so much for sharing this. really interesting. It was so intriguing when I first saw it, and I see the benefits of that back and forth as well. And I'm really excited to see so much interest in this. Again, I just want to make clear that what I was trying to show was GenAI and how it can be supportive of reflection. I know there's a lot of people that are concerned that, oh, students only use GenAI to go in and get the answer. And I really liked how this use is helping students develop, their own ability to question